Okay, so we might get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the second Inequality in Australian live session. This one, a very exciting panel. So if you were here in the last session, you know that there's been a lot of research, a lot of interest in inequality, and probably even if you weren't at the last session, over the last probably 20 years or so, inequality has been increasing through various measures, and there's been increasing interest in understanding the causes of that and documenting how it's different depending on how you measure it and what the consequences are. And of course, as economists, we care about this because we care about welfare, yeah, and we also sort of care about structural issues in the economy that might be potentially driving this, so skill bias, technological change, or other factors. So at ACE this year, we decided to have a couple sessions talking about it. So the last one was really more about documenting in facts and figures what's been happening in terms of inequality in Australia using several different types of measures, including income, consumption, earnings and whatnot. But then this afternoon now, we thought we'd bring together a few people from different places in the economy, different kinds of representations of economics and politics, and have an assortment of views about the potential consequences of inequality and also its causes, less oriented towards facts and figures and more towards experience and, of course, a lot of research backing as well. So we have three people on the panel. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they are listed in the program. So the first person we have is actually the member for Kingsford Smith and the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury in Australia. He's actually, I live in Kingsford, so he's my local MP, Matt Thistlethwaite. But this is actually, he's not on the panel because I know him, although I have been on a stage with him. I originally had signed up Andrew Lee to be part of this panel, and then Andrew had to go and tour some natural gas fields in the Northern Territory or something like this, I think, Gordon Fields. And so I was looking for a replacement, and I thought Matt would be perfect. So we're very happy to have him. And we also have Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute, and I have a little bio for her here. She's a fellow of the Grattan Institute. Her main research interests are tax and budget policy and intergenerational inequality. She previously worked as a principal economist at the ACCC, the senior consultant at NERA Economic Consultants, a director in the mergers branch of the ACCC, and as a senior research economist at the PC. She has a Master's of Economics and a Master's in Competition Law from the University of Melbourne and a Bachelor of Economics Honours from the University of Adelaide. She's the National and Victorian Chair of the Women in Economics Network, which has been getting a lot of airtime at this conference so far, and sits on the Victorian and Central Council for the ESA. So we're very happy to have Danielle with her vast amount of experience there. And we finally have Cameron Murray, who is an economist and consultant who specializes in property markets, environmental economics, and corruption. He co-authored the book Game of Mates, which I think is here. Yes, Game of Mates, How Favors Bleed the Nation. You will have seen I've been dropping the name. Yes, oh, we have a purchaser right here in the front row. Yep, okay. There are a few more books, I think, still at the registration desk. If anybody's interested, maybe after this conversation you'll be particularly interested. He teaches at the University of Queensland. He blogs at fresheconomicthinking.com and tweets as Dr. Cameron Murray. Okay, so I'm really just organizing this panel because I guess I was the person logically holding the baby, so I don't want to talk too much for myself, but I'm going to start off by getting each of these people to maybe speak for maybe 3 minutes or so on what your view is on the current situation with respect to inequality in Australia and what the potential causes of it are. And if there are any policy remedies that you particularly think are important. And then I have a few more questions I want to ask that maybe get a little pricklier as we go through. And then, obviously open to the floor and take questions from everyone to address to the panelists. So maybe we'll start, again, in order that's on the program. Let's start with Matt. And, speak for 3 minutes. I'll give you a little 1 minute thing if you start to go way over, which I'm sure you won't.
Do you want me to speak from up there?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'll come up there.
Yay, thanks, Matt. Thank you, Gigi. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I thank ACE for the opportunity to speak in this very important session about inequality, and at the outset acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. What I thought I'd do is give you an overview of the community that I represent and how inequality manifests itself on a daily basis in my area, and then talk a little bit about some of the solutions that Labor is working on to deal with the burgeoning problem of inequality in our society. I represent Kingsford Smith. It's in the southeast of Sydney, and it covers suburbs like Randwick, Coogee, Maroubra, La Perouse, Botany and Mascot. Above average incomes for people that work and live in this area, asset-rich particularly if you own your own home, and even if you have a mortgage on it, you tend to be doing pretty well in our area, and above average education levels. Despite that, you'll still encounter inequality on a daily basis in the area that I represent. And I'll give you a typical day in Maroubra, which is where my electorate office is. If I walk out the door in Maroubra, in the morning I will generally at around 10:30, 11 o'clock encounter a group of middle-aged men that sit across the road in the park drinking all day. Now, whilst the characteristics of these people aren't uniform, obviously, I do regularly interact with them, principally because they're across the road from my office and I see them on a daily basis. And I do my best to try and help with a whole host of issues, drug and alcohol rehab, housing issues, and other welfare issues. But their problems are complex, and unfortunately, there are certain characteristics of some within that group. They tend to, of course, be unemployed. They tend to have not finished high school, or if they have, at the very best, gone to high school and no tertiary education. Unfortunately, many of them are Aboriginal. And when you look at the Aboriginal population in the community that I represent, and indeed in wider Australia, you get a great picture of inequality manifest on a daily basis. When it comes to health, their life expectancy is 10 years less than the average Australian. When it comes to education levels, they tend to not finish high school, and very few go on to further study. A young Aboriginal man in our community these days is more likely to go to Long Bay Jail down the road than to go to the University of New South Wales as a student. A shocking statistic when it comes to rates of incarceration. The problems of these people, as I mentioned, are quite complex. But what really does get to me and worries me is that the welfare, the health, the justice systems aren't robust enough to deal with these complex issues that each and every one of these people have to get them back on their feet. Another characteristic of many of them is that in some respects their parents would have gone through a similar situation. So the poverty that they encounter because of a whole host of issues tends to be intergenerational. And that's the most difficult challenge, I believe, for governments in this day when it comes to inequality. Getting people out of that cycle of poverty that they tend to grow up in. For many of them, they don't know anything else. They don't know anything else. I've got 4 kids, and since they were born, my wife and I have read to them every night. It's no surprise then that obviously they're good readers and they love reading. I visit many, many households where I see kids that grow up without a book in the house, without access to one book. And it's no wonder that they struggle at school. They don't enjoy education and they drop out of the education system and are likely to end up behind the 8 ball for the rest of their lives. When I walk across the road, heading on to a cafe, I'll encounter a parent. And a parent will talk to me about the cost of housing and they'll say, I've got kids in their 30s that are still living at home with me and I can't get rid of them. And the reason is they can't afford to move out. So housing is a big issue. And house prices in the community that I represent have gone through the roof. And Labor, of course, is trying to deal with that through changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax and other measures. I'll then walk across the road to the cafe to grab a coffee. Typically, I'll be served by a woman that's working in that cafe who'd be earning a minimum wage. In fact, 60% of people who work in that industry tend to be women. It's a person whose income wouldn't have kept pace with the cost of living in recent years. On average, wages, I don't need to tell you, are growing at about 1.9%. Wages share of GDP has fallen to 46.2%. Yet, people such as this are going to face more difficulties with penalty rates on Sundays being cut. If it's a woman, they won't be keeping pace when it comes to superannuation, typically, because of intermittent breaks in the workforce. And simply the fact that if you're on a low wage, the current level of 9.5% superannuation won't cut it in years to come in terms of remaining off the pension. So there's some of the challenges that I face on a daily basis that are replicated in every electorate throughout the country when it comes to inequality. And there's some of the challenges that we face as economists and as politicians in evening and levelling the playing field and giving people greater access to a better chance at life. We've had 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth in Australia, but for many, particularly for Aboriginal people, for young people trying to get into the housing market, for low-income workers and women, it doesn't feel like that. And that's the challenge that we all have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next we have Danielle Wood to speak for a few minutes.
Thanks, Gigi. It's always a hard act to follow a politician, and that's no exception. I will delve a little bit into facts and figures because I can't help myself, but also I think when we talk about inequality, I think there's sometimes a tendency amongst the media and some commentators to kind of assume that what's happening in the US is what's happening here, but I think in Australia we actually have a slightly more nuanced picture. So apologies to anyone in the previous session if I'm going over old ground, but in Australia our gross incomes are very unequal by Western nation standards. We're actually the second most unequal after the United States, but we have a highly redistributive tax and transfer system. So our taxes are kind of middle of the pack. Our welfare system is highly targeted. We have a lot more means testing of payments than other countries. So once you're looking at disposable income, so after taxes and transfers, we actually come out kind of around the middle of OECD countries. Another point I think that's not well understood is that income inequality hasn't actually been growing particularly strongly over the past 15 years. It obviously depends on what measure you look at. Share of incomes going to the top 1% has risen, but if you look at other measures that look more across the income distribution, like the Gini coefficient, there hasn't actually been much change in that. That said, there are clearly particular groups that have fared poorly. Matt has referred to low-income men, and that really clearly stands out in the data. There's the one group that's gone backwards in terms of their real incomes in the past 20 years. On the other hand, across the income distribution for women, incomes have continued to grow. Wealth inequality, on the other hand, is more of an issue, and we have seen an increase in inequality in wealth. But again, it's different to the United States situation. So there, they've actually had people at the lower end of the distribution going backwards. In Australia, wealth inequality has increased because wealth for people at the top has grown faster than it has for people at the bottom, but everyone has been going forward on average. So at the moment at Grattan, we're doing a project on political disenfranchisement, I could say, or basically looking at the rising minor party vote in Australia, and a lot of people have put forward inequality as one of the key reasons for that growth. And we're certainly finding that doesn't sort of line up with the data. There seems to be a lot more factors kind of going on rather than just inequality. That said, we are coming... Yeah, I think that's better.
Come back.
Seems to have a bit of an aversion to me. Okay. Oh, so much better. Fantastic. Excellent. Now, what was I saying? Yes, so I was going to say that we are clearly in a period of low wages growth, as Matt has already touched on. The labour share of national income is falling, capital share is rising, so we will expect to see that start to flow through to those income inequality statistics. And I was chatting to Roger Wilkins at the Melbourne Institute, who does a lot of work on this, and his view of why we see income inequality kind of front and centre in the debate at the moment is not necessarily because we've seen big shifts. It's because when you have stagnating standard of living, people become more focused on that question of fairness and how you divide up the pie. Do I have time to talk about intergenerational inequality?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I'll just say a quick word on intergenerational inequality because I think that's a really important part of the inequality story and something that I think we should be putting a bit more policy emphasis on. In Australia, that's largely manifested in terms of differentials in wealth accumulation. So older households, so if you take a household 65 to 74, on average, they are $400,000 richer today than a household of that same age was 10 years ago. If you take a household headed by someone 25 to 34, on average, they are no richer today than a household of that age 10 years ago. So we have a huge disparity in wealth accumulation. That's largely driven by what's been happening in housing markets. Obviously, the older people are more likely to own a home than that younger group has been. And we're also starting to see now some evidence of growing disparity in terms of income growth as well. So stagnant wages, more part-time work tends to disproportionately affect young people. And we can certainly look to the United States and the United Kingdom of where that process can go. So they've had much longer periods of stagnant wages growth. They're now in a world where someone born in the 1980s has lower real income than someone born 10 years before that did at the same age. So basically we've lost that expectation that each generation will be better off than the one preceded it. So that's why I particularly think that that's a really important policy issue and one that we should be engaging with sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Danielle.
Yeah.
We gave a clap to Matt. Okay, so Cameron Murray, you cue.
Oh, lucky me, I get to stay here. Thanks everyone for coming to this session. I guess I'm going to say two things that you might not agree with. One, that poverty is not complex at all. Two, there's always going to be someone on the bottom of the pyramid, of the social structure. So a lot of the solutions we talk about, and I'm going to mention Matt's there about, oh, well, if they had more books or had a better education, well, somebody's still going to be on the bottom, even if everyone can read. We might be back here 10 years' time and going, well, they don't even have a computer, they can't even code at home, therefore they're left behind. It's just going to go up a notch. You don't solve a distributional issue by getting everybody to move, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing I'm going to say is that the problem of inequality is not complex, okay? It's complex if you think that markets by default deliver optimal outcomes and you don't want to interfere with them, and all you want to do is tinker around the edges and pretend that certain things might help, and if only we do this, and then through some elaborate mechanism, the outcome at the other end is a change in the income or wealth of certain people. Markets fail pretty much by default. I was having a conversation with my wife about that, and we were talking about market failure. She's a psychologist, and she has strong opinions on things, so we have heated dinner debates. And I said, look, you know, even in some markets, there's a persistent oversupply. It's not like markets work all the time. And she goes, I thought she was going to give me an example. Oh, you mean like diamonds, or you mean like jewellery? And she goes, oh, you mean like the oversupply of economists? So yeah, if you think that the market solutions are the only thing in the toolkit, yeah, you're going to have a big problem with inequality, aren't you? Because that's the natural outcome of markets. We know in every competitive market, one firm starts growing faster than the other and begins to dominate in that market. That's how it works, okay? But if you realise that the markets are a result of the institutions we create and the rules we set, and you expand your scope of thinking, then you can see that it's not so much of a problem at all. Now, in the book, that's the approach I take. I look at these broader, who sets the rules, how they're set, and who sets up the institutions. And the view that I get is that we're in a long-term cycle of the social structures becoming more connected and tighter at the top of the distribution. And those people, as part of those social structures, when the markets fail, which is all the time, they're using the power they have to look after their mates, those other well-connected people at the top, and not everybody else. And so that's what is underlying this hollowing out of the middle class, and I think that's what's going on in terms of the political disruption we're seeing. People fleeing towards the minor parties. Is this stable middle class that didn't have to get a higher education to have a comfortable life? Just it's not a thing anymore. And the people that grew up expecting that sort of life are just not getting it. And there's many reasons for that, and I obviously wrote a whole book about how those favours get traded and how your typical wage earner who's just trying to have a simple job, a secure house, is struggling at every turn because they're not part of any of these well-connected groups getting an unfair share. I don't know if I want to say too much more about it. I hope you just grab my book on your way out, but maybe as we discuss in the panel. But I hope that's something to think about and stimulate some questions.
Okay, so I'm going to just ask a few questions of the panelists, and you can jump in, whoever would like to answer, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So I want to pick up on, of course, something that Cameron was alluding to, and also something that came up in the previous session on inequality in regard to the returns to unobservable characteristics. So at the very top end of the distribution of income, right, we saw in some of the stuff that Jeff Borland was presenting last session that there's been, I think it was Jeff Borland or maybe Gianni Cava from the RBA, that there's been sort of an increase in returns to stuff we can't see. And I guess I'm wondering, in terms of how we understand inequality, to what extent is better measurement of things that we can't see something that we want to aim for as policy, as a policy input, basically, to improve the kinds of institutions that we design, the kinds of plans that we have in terms of how to redistribute things. What is it that we can't see that is relevant to understanding inequality and that could be an input to policy setting?
Well, there are plenty of examples of them in government policy. One would be capital gains tax discounts on the sale of assets. And if you look at the distribution of where the benefit of those goes, it's overwhelmingly to high income earners in Australia. So when you talk about the capital gains tax discount on the sale of investment properties, 70% of that benefit goes to the top 10% of income earners in the country. And that's something that, that's something that Labor is seeking to address by a change in policy, by reducing that discount by 50%, coupled with changes to negative gearing, restricting it to new investment properties. We believe will redistribute some of that income and level the playing field for people, particularly those trying to buy their first home.
I mean, I think there's, there's lots of types of inequality. I don't know if this is what you were alluding to, but, we focus as economists a lot on income and wealth because we care about consumption opportunities now and into the future. But, there's educational inequality, health inequality, social cohesion can be a factor. And I have to say, I've sort of come pretty late to this whole literature. I've only started looking at it for the project we're doing at the moment, but there's a whole lot of groups out there, including the ABS, that are coming up with these kind of more comprehensive measures of inequality. So you can actually, have a look at a map, or you can, cross-cut the data and see which groups or locations are particularly disadvantaged on this kind of broader measures. And I think I really liked the Carol Graham session yesterday morning. I think what she said there was exactly right, that we shouldn't see these as a substitute for the kind of standard economic indicators, but they are a very useful complement. And as policymakers, I think, if the headline numbers look okay, but they're telling us something that there's particular groups we should be looking to, then I think that they're very kind of useful input into the policymaking process.
And I guess you're probably referring a little bit to things like measures of well-being, subjective well-being.
Yeah, there's subjective well-being, and then there's just a whole lot of kind of more comprehensive indexes where they try and pull in, health, education, social outcomes into a single index that measures relative advantages and disadvantages.
Cameron?
In terms of things that we'd like to measure that we don't know, I think if we're looking at the distribution of wealth, as a general rule, those with the most wealth are able to hide it the most easily. So I'm thinking here of family trusts and ways to hide income. I'm thinking here of shelf companies and other methods to hide the ultimate ownership of assets. And I'm thinking here of the land titles database. It's actually very expensive to find out who owns what in each state in this country. It's sort of ridiculous that we have a publicly funded database of who owns what, and the sale of it is outsourced and privatised to particular entities to make a monopoly profit on. Not only that, I think New South Wales is proposing to privatise their whole land titles office, and there has been a discussion of privatising. It's done. Let me give you an example. Okay, to go to this unobserved characteristics that's having this abnormally high return at the top of the distribution, I did a study on landowners to see who got a favourable rezoning decision and who didn't, by looking at landowners immediately inside a favourable decision and immediately next door or across the road that had the similar types of land but just missed out. And so I tried to map the relationship network of them. I had to find out who owned the land, who owned the companies that owned the land, who the shareholders of the companies were, who was connected through other sorts of social networks. It cost me $11,000 to do that, just with 6 different rezoning sites. Okay? And the ultimate result there was that your social connections, your connectedness in the network, predicted with great accuracy whether your land fell just on the inside rather than the outside. And those connected landowners got a $410 million gain for free as a gift from the government. Okay? Now, had that been in the ACT, they would have charged 75% of that value gain. 300 million of that would have been redistributed to the rest of us through reduced taxes elsewhere. But in the rest of the country, it's a freebie. And that's $11 billion across the country we're giving away through these types of political decisions that are ultimately determined by these networks of who owns what and who's related to who. The problem being we can't actually systematically observe that because it's all hidden. So I spent the money and I did the time and I got it, but I still ran into many dead ends. When I hit family trusts, when I hit international companies that I couldn't find out who owned, I just hit a dead end. And now I've learned a good lesson of how to hide my wealth, that's for sure. But if you want to understand the distribution of wealth and the power that that wealth gives you at the top of the distribution, okay, we can't observe anything from the outside. We need to open that up, to crack that open for the rest of us to see. That's the first step to undoing this sort of these insider trades and these networks of power. So in terms of measuring something, that would be one of my first steps, making the land titles and the ASIC database public.
Danielle?
I'll just quickly jump in because you just made me think of something. I've also been trying to look through family trusts, and I agree with your frustration that it's incredibly opaque and difficult. But another area I think where we could do with better data in terms of wealth is on inheritances. Because we do not tax inheritances in this country, we do not have a clear picture of just how large and what the distribution of those are. You can kind of pull some information out of the Hilda data set, but it's pretty unreliable. And if you're interested in wealth inequality, that's clearly a way in which that gets compounded, because inheritances tend to go on average to people that are more wealthy. So I think that's another area where it would be great to have some more data.
Quick plug for the book. Inheritance taxes, I do talk about them. We phased them out.
Not in that chapter yet, clearly.
Not up to that chapter yet. It's in the early 80s we phased it out. We used to raise 2 or 3% of total tax revenue through inheritance taxes, and we phased that out to 0, and the equivalent now is many, many billions of dollars. If we just had the same system we had 30 years ago, with the same amount of avoidance and everything that went with it. Okay,
Yeah.
it's a freebie, and we could reinstate it with no problems at all.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, what we do see internationally though is there is actually quite a high level of avoidance. So you look at different countries that actually have inheritance taxes, none of them raise huge percentage of their tax revenue that way, because the people that give the biggest inheritances have the best advisors and do find ways to avoid them. Nonetheless, it's not necessarily a reason for not going there.
So I'm going to ask Matt, as an actual legislator, is Cameron's conjecture correct that it would actually be a no-brainer and reasonably easy to reinstate these taxes?
We're brave, but we're not crazy.
Who are you looking at?
We did have inheritance taxes. Joe Bjelke-Petersen started the ball rolling on getting rid of them. Unfortunately, given the cost of housing these days, I think many people see housing as something that the only thing really that they can pass on to their kids to give them a start in life. And if we talked about starting to tax that as an asset once someone died, I think we'd face quite a community backlash. I appreciate that the arguments about inequality. We think that from a policy perspective, it's probably best to try and tackle the inequality through the capital gains tax and negative gearing issue at the beginning before you started looking at something like that.
Yeah, why not both? But also you can exempt the principal place of residence and have thresholds as well. So write that on your policy list. Thanks, mate. Just
But
kidding.
to be fair to Matt, I think if we were going to go that path, it's probably got to be a Commonwealth. I mean, you don't want that race to the bottom again that we
Well, that's
had
what happened.
when
Yeah, one of the
Queensland
states moved, and then the
moved. People
other
about
states
to
moved
die
with
moved
it.
state.
Yeah.
So I want to draw a connection here, moving on a little bit from this discussion, to the sessions yesterday on growth. So originally when ACE 2017 wanted to have sessions on both growth and inequality, the notion was to have them thematically linked, and in particular through a connection to this sort of ideology of protectionism versus free open trade, etc. And in light of the political events we've seen in the last few years with Brexit and Trump and the rise of things like One Nation and whatever, people are thinking that maybe there's a connection between the trade policies and general openness towards capital and labor movements in a particular country with respect to its neighbors and increasing inequality or worsened outcomes, whether it's with respect to income or well-being or psychological stress or anything else. So I just want to ask the panel: do you guys think that this is a credible connection? Is it valid to advocate for protectionist policies in order to try to shore up inequality in Australia?
I would say no, it's not valid. Look, when you remove trade barriers, it's nothing new to say there's winners and losers. So the theory has always been we do that, we grow national incomes, and then we find a way to redistribute that income so you compensate the losers. There's been a lot of focus on, reskilling people in affected industries, on compensating particular locations where they lose their major industry. But I think it's probably fair to say the view is that hasn't always happened enough. And the fact that we can see this particularly disadvantaged group, the blue-collar men that we were talking about, means that that policy hasn't worked perfectly. And you can certainly see that when you look at attitudes in surveys towards free trade. I was fairly surprised to learn that less than 40% of Australians think free trade is a good thing. More than 75% think we should be manufacturing more in Australia and bringing in less from overseas. So we still don't have a high level of community support for free trade policies. That said, I think if we were going to try and put in place barriers, they would be counterproductive. I think, I don't think those jobs are coming back, is bottom line. I think there's a lot of studies that show that it's not just about trade, it's also about automation. As countries get richer, they tend to spend more on services, less on goods. So putting up trade barriers is going to increase prices for consumers and I think have little benefit in terms of unemployment for that group. So I think we need a much broader discussion about those people that have been disadvantaged, what we can do for them. There was a really interesting sort of question about this in the Carol Graham talk again, where there was discussion of, these people have lost what were pretty stable, high status jobs in the manufacturing sector. The jobs that they now have available to them tend to be less secure, lower status jobs, so things like aged care or food services. How do we transition them into those sectors, if that's the right answer, and how do we kind of improve the status and the feeling about those roles? Or there's, of course, the broader question of whether you go to universal basic income and then you encourage them to volunteer or do something in the community to try and replace that kind of sense of worth that they would otherwise be getting from a job. But they are big and difficult policy questions.
I agree. I don't think that we should be putting up protectionist barriers. I think overwhelmingly Australia has benefited from reducing barriers to trade, not only in terms of national income, but also for individuals in terms of their incomes and lifestyle choices. You only need to look at the cost of the average car has come down dramatically since we reduced tariffs in that industry. I can remember growing up as a kid, we never ever went on an international holiday overseas because you couldn't afford the airfare. But now, because of reductions in protection in that industry, those types of trips are now accessible to average income families. There's no doubt that there's a genuine disconnect and a genuine feeling of animosity amongst people who've been left behind by this economic transformation, predominantly men in the manufacturing sector. And the principal cause of that is that they've lost jobs. And governments have tried their darndest to retrain people, to provide them with additional skills. But at the end of the day, it doesn't mean two hoots if you haven't got someone a job. And governments haven't really been good at that. And in many respects, some would say, well, does government have to be involved in that? So that's the real challenge. A quick anecdote for people. The last election campaign, Malcolm Turnbull was always talking about, this is the greatest time to be alive, the age of openness, the age of innovation and all that sort of stuff. Then all of a sudden you would have noticed about halfway through the election campaign he stopped talking about it. The reason was it simply wasn't working. An anecdote from a Labor focus group that was being conducted in Wollongong, where a welder said, in respect of what Malcolm Turnbull had been saying at the time, these are his words, not mine, quote, "What the fuck does he want me to do, weld two iPads together?" And I think that perfectly, sums up the disconnect that people have felt in respect of, the way globalisation and the way the world's moved. If you can't supply them with the job, they're not going to go for it.
I'm going to disagree. I may have said this earlier, but if you think free markets are the only, if that's the scope of your solution, you're going to end up in this same problem. Oh, sorry people, you have to deal with it. We're all better off. There's this sort of, I know free markets are the best, don't tell me about your life situation. In terms of also the free market, taking credit for the decline in the cost of air travel, the world's major airlines were all the result of national industrial policy and protectionist measures. Virgin Australia, the new competitor, okay? Free money from the Queensland government plus advantages through preference deals for flying interstate for Queensland public servants. Okay, these things aren't automatic and magic. The market is not this magician. So I think, and all the countries we trade with, I mean, look at China's growth. This is not the magic of markets at worth. This is a magic of old-fashioned industrial policy, building up those domestic capacities so you can compete internationally. That's what works. So I don't think this is, I'm not anti-trade, I'm anti-fair trade. Isn't it ridiculous that we would say, oh no, we must trade with this country that has a heavily subsidised automotive industry, but we can't subsidise ours, or we can't support ours or stimulate ours. It makes no sense. We're going to just be mining dirt and looking after each other and changing bedpans. Now, you might, be well-trained economists and think I'm talking out my arse here. Or you could go to Harvard or MIT and look at the Atlas of Economic Complexity and the analysis of the complexity of the production chains in different countries. And you can look that we've fallen from 19th to 52nd in the last 30 years. Some of the quotes I'm going to paraphrase from the latest analysis of the complexity of Australia's productive capacities. The laggards of the Asian region include Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. Our economy is becoming less diverse. We're less able, in terms of international benchmarks, to produce complex goods and manufacture a variety of goods that have high diminishing returns to scale that we can scale up and export. So I think there is a role. We can sit here and pretend, oh, markets are great, look at markets, and we can just get walked over by all those countries that don't pretend that and see the value of having a diverse industrial base. And I think the average person wants that. So we can be undemocratic and say, stuff you, markets work, believe me, get on with it, change your mind. Or we can listen to the people and say, maybe they're onto something, because maybe those guys at MIT are onto something as well, put two and two together and think constructively about how we support diversity in the economy without just giving out freebies to particular political mates. So I disagree.
Okay, so Cameron, I have to. This is just too interesting not to ask a follow-up question. I'm sure the two of you probably want to too. So I guess I want to poke you on this, this challenge of developing a way to subsidize without having it turn into a rort, because so many stories of subsidization have been a story of mates.
Sure. Just remember, there's always mates. Okay. So what we've got to do is make sure that the gains to mates are lower. So I call it something for something regulation. Never give out money without getting something in return. You car industry, want this? You must produce 10,000 electric vehicles or you can pay us back. You, certain industry, want this? You must produce something or you give it back. There's actually hurdles. We look at the other day, I think it was $30 million to Foxtel to broadcast sport. Who even knows if they broadcast anything? Okay, that was a giveaway. It wasn't for something, it was something for nothing. And as long as we keep that in mind, I think there's many, many ways we can do it. Okay, it's not that crazy. We've done it before. Many countries do it now and have done it historically. We can create our own public competitors if you like, so that we're not handing gifts to private entities and the owners of those entities, and the employees of those organisations get a share in the gains and get them trying to build something that's never been done before. It's totally possible. Okay, we need the political will. We need to stop going, oh, free markets will solve everything. We'll just get stuff from China and sell them iron and coal. That's our vision. Okay, if we break free from that, we can try anything. I mean, we've got free markets, we've got lack of subsidies, okay, but we've got more giveaways than I think we've had for years. I added up in the book hundreds of billions of dollars of political freebies, of tax breaks, of loopholes, of giveaways, rezoning decisions. The lack of competition because the government won't say it. Do you know what? Just because there are 4 companies in that industry doesn't mean they're competing on price, because we've got a barrier to entry. Okay? What if we had a public competitor as well? They would have to outdo that public competitor. Okay? They would have to compete on price. If we gave out a favour to those mates, okay, the public competitor would get it through and pass it along to customers in lower prices. You couldn't just hoard those gifts. Okay? There's many, many opportunities. Of course there are risks, but we're not comparing to this benchmark perfect world that doesn't exist. We're comparing to this imperfect reality we have now, where there's plenty of giveaways already.
I think I'm just sort of, I feel like you're confusing 2 concepts, or you're thinking about 2 concepts. I mean, there's a lot of talk of markets failing, but to me, a lot of the examples in your books are actually about government's failure, about governments setting the rules or giving away things, as you say, without getting a fair return to taxpayers.
Sure, but just remember, a market is nothing but a set of rules by government to create certain property rights. Okay?
Yes.
So if you're saying the government has set it up wrong, that there is some right way,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I still think that is, well, I guess it's what you label it, but you can set up a market with the right rules and then let the market rip. But I don't understand how your point about subsidising the car industry kind of fits with your overall thesis. It might be returning to Gigi's question. I mean, that seems to me to be another giveaway by government. Why do you think that's the right answer? I mean, what do you think that we're achieving by supporting an industry that's shown itself over a long period of time to be uncompetitive? It's clearly a subsidy for a particular set of workers at a broader cost to the Australian economy.
Sure. So I guess there's a few things. One, let me think how to phrase this. We spend a lot of money on things for many, many reasons, okay? Not just because we get a positive return for that particular investment, okay? So if we think about the economy as a broader system, we can do certain things at certain parts of that system that cost money that give payoffs elsewhere, okay? So we're talking about this struggle of inequality. Oh, it's a costly thing, it's bad for people, yet we won't think about a solution that, do you know what? It's not that costly to support a particular industry that's going to contribute to solving this other broader problem of a whole bunch of low-skilled people or technically skilled people that have nowhere else to go, that don't want to move from their regions, that has a costly solution to it. So the question is not, there is this perfect benchmark world. The question is 30 billion, or whatever a number is there, supporting this industry and all the upstream industries involved, are the general payoffs worth it compared to some alternative use of that money, or a world without doing that and the consequences of not doing that?
Yeah, I agree. So it's about the relative cost. So the alternative is to not subsidise that industry and help those people retrain or do something similar and give them some sort of compensation. And I feel like every person that's looked into those subsidies to the car industry. Well, we spoke about that. Why not go into aged care or any of those industries where there is a shortage of people?
I
think
just don't
cost
see
per job
middle-aged
is-
welders
Can I-
retraining to change bedpans for other. I just don't see it happening.
So maybe we let Matt have a
Yeah, I've got to say I agree. I think that there were good reasons for subsidies in the car industry. And if you look at internationally at the 11 or 12 nations that do produce automobiles, all of them subsidise those industries. And they do so because generally they're quite technical jobs. There's a lot of research and development that goes into them. They're moving into the renewable space, and there are spin-offs beyond that particular industry for the broader economy. So you can justify it, I believe, on the basis that there's an income benefit to the nation and a welfare and living standards benefit beyond that. I don't agree with the notion that most government handouts don't come with some strings attached or the something for something notion. And the classic example of that is in renewable energy. The feed-in tariffs are a good example in encouraging people to install solar panels on their roofs. The difficulty with that is that the way that the system worked was that it was poor people that ended up subsidising rich people to put solar panels on their roofs. So you've got to work through how the system operates and who the winners and losers are. But I don't subscribe to the view that all subsidies are bad and that we should have free markets. It's the outcome that you seek to get out of it that's important.
Yeah, can I just jump in? I think it's cost benefit, but I just think that all the evidence suggests that those subsidies did not meet that cost benefit threshold. They were very expensive. They didn't ensure that industry was ever going to be sustainable. And on a cost per job basis, I just think it was not the right decision. It's a question of quantum. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine. Well, I have a few more questions, but I also am conscious I want to have plenty of time from the floor questions. So I'm gonna park the issue of whether or not welders should be retrained to change bedpans. Although we may come back to that because I think the notion of stigmatizing certain kinds of occupations may get in the way of improvements to inequality. Let's move to sort of what is, in fact, given the political environment we face at the moment, what is actually feasible? And this is something that, a lot of times economists don't talk about. We talk about, what would be nice in a hypothetical world is, benevolent dictator would do X. And in fact, given the institutional constraints, and Matt will be particularly familiar with these constraints, and I mean, even what he says here is constrained by his position in the government, right? We can all see this, right? It's quite obvious.
I'm not in government.
Well, okay, but not in government, right? But it is quite obvious. It's an elected representative must represent, right? And that constrains the way he operates. And of course, being witness to the way in which laws are talked about and then potentially made, he would have some insights into this. But I'm curious. I'd like to come out of this session with some notion of what kind of measures, what kind of changes to our current structure of laws, regulations, institutional oversight, etc., are feasible politically, A, and B, actually have a realistic chance of improving inequality in Australia?
I'll go first. A few things. A more progressive income tax system, I think, is feasible, and there's a clear difference between the major parties on that at the moment. The current government's proposing to reduce the top income tax threshold. We're proposing to leave it in place. They're proposing to reduce the corporate tax rate. We're proposing to leave it in place. Property taxes, again, I've mentioned this before, negative gearing and capital gains tax, and retirement incomes. There's ridiculous tax concessions that go to the wealthiest Australians when it comes to superannuation that are simply unsustainable in the future, and we'll see more and more people have to rely on the old age pension rather than fund their own retirement incomes, and women are particularly in the target there. So there's three areas where I think reform is achievable, where you can redistribute income that brings fairer outcomes.
Yep, I would agree with a lot of that. I would add to the list, I think we need to do something about the level of New Start and rent assistance, which has clearly fallen well behind where it should be in terms of people achieving a very basic standard of living in our major cities. And I think it's sad there's been a lack of political will on both sides to tackle that over the past decade. If I was to think about kind of longer term reforms, I think planning laws, changes to those to allow increase in housing supply in the inner and middle ring suburbs so people can live closer to jobs, maybe with some of Cameron's value capture type mechanisms in place, so the government gets the benefit from that. And I also think early childhood education is one area of government spending where all the studies show you get a very high return. It's also a very effective way to reduce inequality over the long term, because it means that children from disadvantaged backgrounds actually get a much better start in life than they do if the first time they're interacting with the kind of institutional system is when they get to primary school.
Wow, we're agreeing again. That's good. I don't think any of those are going to happen in the next little while in terms of political feasibility. Maybe when Matt gets more power in the party, we'll see some change. But let me just cast your mind back to the mining tax. Okay, that was brilliant in principle, but then the mates came out and they crushed it. Look what's happening at the petroleum resource rent tax right now. Okay, Norway has a similar tax. Their revenues have skyrocketed the last 10 years. Ours have plummeted. Why? Because since the late 90s, we've been writing in loopholes for all of our mates. We had a review. I wrote to the review and I said, if you are not willing to pick a fight with these petroleum companies and have them wage a media war against you, do not even bother. Because if you are successful at reviewing this petroleum resource rent tax, it's going to be worth billions for them to fight you however they can. A few months later in the media, we see the minister, whoever, what's his face, who it's irrelevant for the discussion right now, said, oh, you know what, we've had this review, it's been really interesting, but I don't think we should touch it. I don't think we should claw back almost $2 billion a year that we've given away as freebies in the last 10 years. I just don't think we should. So you can see just how tight a hold these networks have on power. So I think very few of these are politically feasible. I think where the political timing might be right soon. Okay, I think things are going to get worse, and I think people will really start being politically active when real wages fall for a little bit longer. I think that's one of the triggers. A few things I would change the structure of the Reserve Bank to allow lending and accounts held by the public, essentially competing with the private banking sector, okay, which is essentially a protected oligopoly. Made $30 billion in pre-tax profits. Probably half of that is just rent. I would stop privatising things and selling them off to mates who essentially, it's a gift to the wealthiest who get to capitalise on owning these monopolies as soon as they're privatised, and then they creatively think of ways to then ratchet up their returns. The value capture, I don't think this rezoning thing, that's the biggest distraction I've ever heard. Okay, this is this something for nothing. Oh, if we don't rezone, you'll get no housing supply. Oh, okay, I'll rezone you. Hang on. You just gave them a freebie. They're not going to build anything. You got to get something for something. They're just going to flog it off to the next guy. In the ACT, they charge, as I said. So I think that's just a bogeyman. That's the developer industry's spruik on that one. There's plenty of housing. Some huge number of the approved developments never get up anyway because the developer's waiting for the market to shift and they'll release it when they want. So that's another example of that. But I think things are going to get worse in the equality sphere before they get better, and that political critical mass is here.
Okay, so just one final question I'm going to ask. I'm picking up on what everybody just said. So I noticed that all of the interventions that you guys came out with, even Cameron's suggestions, so no privatization or less privatization, a public bank, early childhood investments, New Start real assistance levels going up, more progressive income tax system, negative gearing property tax superannuation reform, all of these things, they sound great, but none of them has to do with actual jobs. And at the beginning of this whole discussion, I think it was you who were saying, the problem is jobs. These guys don't have jobs. Jobs. So where is jobs in all of this? And I mean, going back to something Danielle mentioned, is there a role for something like a government jobs guarantee or some sort of jobs-related direct assistance rather than these things that are sort of, they're around the edges of our existing distribution system?
Yeah, jobs is obviously the key issue. And it's how you create those jobs and make them sustainable and, give people some security in them. That's the big issue. When you look at the jobs network, again, something that was privatised, handed to the private sector, big problems with it. We, as federal politicians, we encounter these every day. So there's a host of issues associated with that. I think in a jobs market that's competitive, the key is providing people with the skills and the education to compete. So providing people with a decent education is the key to that, and that begins from early childhood right through to university. So investment in schools, where we've obviously got a clear difference between Labor's policy and the government's, is very important. What governments have done to apprenticeships and TAFE is criminal in this country. The lack of investment in public TAFE and technical training has been on the downward spiral for many, many years, and we're seeing the results in terms of technical expertise that isn't available in our economy and that employers use as an excuse to bring in 457 visa workers on intermittent contracts and reduce wages and conditions. And then you've got university sector, where the government's withdrawing investment in universities. They propose to increase fees and reduce the subsidy that government gives to underlie those positions in universities. So there's a whole host of ways that you can improve educational outcomes that provide people with the foundation for a good job in a competitive market.
Yeah, I want to return to the point that I made before, because I think, when you look at 457 visas and some of the industries and roles that we're bringing people in for are not highly skilled jobs. So it comes back to that question of, no, I think it's an important question, and how, we've got this group of people that are not able to find work. We've got shortage of people in areas where they don't need a really specific set of skills. How do we bring those two together? And it is about status and jokes about bedpans and things like that. I think there's also gender issues that sit behind it. Those tend to be jobs in feminised workforces. So how do we change that conversation? How do we make those jobs more secure, and how do we change the view of the public about the status of those jobs and the role for men in there? I don't have the answer, but I think it's a really important question.
Okay, I think this skills training is a big distraction. Probably not. Maybe you've expected this by now. Okay, look, a lot of the skills training talk is about outsourcing the training that used to be done internally by large organisations. Okay, here's an example. The vet training system, McDonald's became a huge vet provider. What did they do? They got subsidies for the training they used to already run internally for their own staff. Okay, because if there's a payoff to skills training, there's a payoff to the company that wants to hire them. So the trick is obviously not, let's send people out with more skills. The trick is to get more large institutions who want those skills and are willing to pay for them, because then they will invest. They'll pay for you to go to university. That's what happens in the army. Okay, if they want engineers, they pay for you to go and get a degree because they need engineers. So I think that's a big distraction, the skills thing. Industrial policy. Are you allowed to say that at an economics conference? Look, at the US, they have a space agency. Oh, we could have one of those. Okay, think about all the highly skilled technical jobs and all the research and all those, the flow-on effects. It's a lot like the car industry. In the US, they spend over But this is, you're not going to get anything. You're going to have a race to the bottom if everything has to stack up. Okay, all the third world countries, they follow the free market economic rules and they are poor. Okay, you go to India, you have to negotiate for everything. It's difficult. Do you know what makes you rich? You stop using markets to allocate resources. Okay, it happens all the time. I don't negotiate every day for what I'm going to do at work. I negotiate once, and for the next 4 years, it's to command and control, because that's what it's efficient. Ronald Coaster's been on about it. Okay, markets work in particular circumstances, but there are costs to it. So if we constrain ourselves like this, we're never going to get anywhere. In space, the US spends 1% of federal revenue a year. They spend up to 4.5%. That'd be $4 billion a year if we did the same thing here. We're going to have $4 billion of demand for highly skilled workers, probably in regional centres across the country, because you're obviously not going to launch rockets from the CBD. Okay? Think about it. That's how you get jobs. Okay? There's a lot of, if only the market would supply jobs, when we have this institution, the government and all its departments and this bureaucracy that we've organised for a long time, it's like, I want jobs, but the last thing I want to do is bloody well employ someone to do it. Right? We can do that. We can have a space agency. You want engineers? You want technical people? Fine, try and get this thing into space. Okay? You want this? Try and do this. That's what you do. So I don't think it's in the realm of political feasibility just yet, but give it some time and you will see.
So Danielle is actually itching to have one little small response to that, and maybe I'll give Matt one small response, and then we'll open to the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a plea for good quality cost-benefit analysis in government policy making. All the things you're talking about is a question of quantum, and I believe that the cost per job from the types of interventions you're talking about are just outrageously high. That is not to say the government should never intervene, but you should take into account both sides of that equation in making that decision.
Look, you're going to build a road here for $1 billion a kilometre, okay? The things that are getting done in this world of everything needs a CPA are rubbish.
They don't have a proper CBA.
Okay? I can get my 6-year-old to come up with some better ideas than what we're getting in this world where everything needs a CBA, and we've got all this gamed, we've got a whole industry. There's a few people here who are in the industry of making CBAs give you the answer you want. Okay? Now, that's good for us to say everything needs a CBA, but let's be honest, you can get any answer you want, and if you go down that path, you're going to end up with the CBA that the most powerful person wants getting onto the top of the pile. Anyway.
So what's the alternative? No evaluation of government programs. How are you making trade-offs between government decisions without some kind of framework?
Well, we can do it democratically. Let's just say 75% of people want industrial policy and some sort of trade protection. Well, what's wrong with that? If everyone wants it, okay? You're saying basically people don't know, they're not good at making decisions. We should essentially be non-democratic in those situations. People want, you had some stats before you rattled off, 75% of people want a manufacturing sector supported. Okay, fine. That's a pretty good majority.
Yeah, can I let Matt have one final word, and then we'll open to the floor.
I just think that ultimately governments have a responsibility to the people in how they manage public expenditure and budgets. And for mine, juggling up a space agency compared to trying to put in some programs that alleviate poverty, looking at increasing New Start, you get better value for money in the latter, particularly when you look at it in the context of that there's some great research and development that's being done, particularly in universities throughout the country. One of them's in my electorate at the UNSW on space work, and they've got a space department there. It's just more efficient and better use of public assets if those satellites that they're producing at UNSW are launched by rockets that are being sent up by the US because they do it better than us. So it's how you spend that money and get the best outcome.
Someone asked me a question about this.
Oh, he's clever. Okay, so we've got our roving mic. There we are, and just go for it, yeah.
Hi, my name's Tobias Beckman. I'm from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. One thing that I'm really interested in is your opinion on the spatial element of inequality. So to give you an example, I used to live here in King's Cross, and one of the things that I really liked about it is that while I am relatively well off, I've got a good stable job, I walked past these people who were homeless, who had drug addictions, and all these other elements of inequality that for many people who are living in other places, they don't necessarily get to experience that element of inequality on a day-to-day basis. But having said that, one of the things that Carol was talking about yesterday was how for people's experiences of inequality, that for poor people who live in a really unequal area, that actually has a negative impact on them. So is this just me being a rich person saying, I'd like to be able to see poor people around me? Or do you think that there is actually a benefit for people to be able to see the poor people in their lives and actually recognise, no, this is a way that people live in our society?
Yeah, look, I think the latter. I think there's been pretty good evidence that people are more likely to be empathetic to groups with different incomes if they're exposed to them in their everyday life. And I think as cities get richer and richer, we do tend to see greater stratification. So you have, parts of Melbourne like Toorak where there are very, very few low-income people living, and that means that those people are not exposed to those kind of lives. Just a broader comment on spatial inequality. One of the things we are doing when we are looking at minor party voting, one of the elements of that story in Australia is that in regional areas, the minor party vote is growing particularly quickly. So regional areas have always tended to vote more for minor parties, but that differential is increasing over time. Interestingly, when we look at inequality in different geographies, we actually see lower inequality in regional areas compared to cities, and inequality is actually growing slower in those areas. So another reason why we sort of come to the conclusion that it doesn't seem to be the primary driver of political disillusionment.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think you get more acute inequality in areas where there's higher populations, and that tends to be in cities at the moment. The challenge for legislators and governments is how you distribute the resources to deal with that inequality. And if you look at Sydney at the moment, the electorate that I represent, there's an 8-year waiting list for public housing. So when a single mum comes to you and says, my husband's booted me out, I've got my clothes and the kids, and that's it, it's very, very difficult to get them into public housing when there's an 8-year waiting list. And homelessness shelters, a chock-a-block, they're full to the brim, and you often, as an electorate office, you spend your time ringing around these services trying to help people like that. So that's the challenge for governments. How do you evenly distribute those services that deal with that inequality in particular cities?
I don't know if I've got anything constructive.
Okay. Destructive? All right, let's take the next question because there are a lot of hands. So, yeah.
So, yeah, I think the case that's been made that a lot of the inequality is manipulating rules to create rents and then capturing those rents. I think that's, hard to argue with that. But one area where I think there could be a bit more attention is public sector rents, and particularly one disappointment. I paid my money for your book, Cameron, and Paul's book, but I was really disappointed there wasn't more about universities. Because I think that's one area where your mode of analysis of looking at the networks, I'm thinking particularly of senior university administrators. I think that the universities are more or less a publicly sponsored cartel, and there's a clique of senior administrators who are creaming off fairly large rents in various ways. Do you have any comments on whether that sort of analysis you did of property markets could equally be applied to rent seeking in universities?
Yeah, so there's no chapter, but it's in the other areas chapter. It's the second last chapter. Have you read that bit?
Tiny.
It's not enough for you. Yeah, we sort of didn't want to overplay it given Paul's background, starting fights at universities. So we sort of just tucked it in there. You can read other things Paul's written, but it's certainly ripe as well. In terms of... sorry, did you have a question, or are you just commenting that I need to improve the book? Yeah, sure. So Australia's senior bureaucrats in universities are paid huge amounts more, double, triple, quadruple what they are in the US and the UK. And that's just simply keeping the right people in to look after their mates, make sure they do things that are favourable. There's absolutely no reason to pay that for expertise. But that's really Paul's area. I'm sure he'd send you to 10 blogs he's written on it. I'll have to pass.
Okay, I'm a bit hesitant about this question because I'm trying to think about what Cameron will say about it. But first of all, a disclaimer as well that when I found out about how much the car industry was subsidised here, I thought it was a lot for not a lot back. and personally really annoyed that I paid thousands of dollars more for a car, as did all other Australian consumers, to prop up this one industry, whatever flow-on benefits it had. So I'm not very positive thinking towards it. But in the Boss magazine, in the Financial Review last Friday, and maybe other people have seen that because I only read it once, it's a little almost too good to be true story about Toyota saying, we're closing, we're going, what would you like to do? And they are paying for employees to study and to retrain while they're still working. And some of them were happy to just go and take a payout payment and retire. Some of them want to be nurses, some of them want to be teachers. I can't remember the exact occupations. And maybe that's a bit different because they know when they're going. But is there a corporate responsibility there too? Because we're kind of saying the market fails, and what's the government going to do about finding jobs for them? And that still assumes the job's there, but yeah. Is that a good thing to see Toyota doing? And Toyota is doing it because it says it should get a more productive workforce in this interim time, rather than people just thinking, you're leaving us, you're ditching us, and we're not going to put in much effort.
I'm happy to go. I mean, I think it's a good thing, but I don't think we can't rely on companies to be altruistic. Obviously, you're saying in that situation they might have had a commercial reason for doing that. In a lot of cases, that won't be there. So I think you absolutely need to have some role for government in that process as well. If they do that in conjunction with the corporate sector, then that's a good thing when and where it works.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. What's the job that someone gets out of it at the end of the day? If you look at those jobs in that industry, they were pretty technical. They were well paid by comparative standards. They were unionised. And a lot of the people that worked in those jobs had been there for a very long time. So it's not uncommon to have someone in their mid-50s that's all they've done for their whole adult life. You can provide them with educational opportunities and retraining opportunities, but the reality is, who's going to employ someone in their mid-50s that all they've done is worked in a car manufacturing plant and they're seeking to get a job in another industry? They're the challenges that those people are going to face, and that's the real issue with closing down industries like that.
Next. Who's got the mic? Right, go.
Doug McLeod, Macquarie University. This year at this conference, I've been to a number of sessions where people have talked about protection as if it's a bad thing. And last year at Adelaide, there was even more emphasis on what a bad thing protection is. What I want to know is, if it is so bad, why is it that 2.5 to 3 billion people in Asia have pulled themselves out of poverty in just one generation using protection? Well, the first reason is that they don't call it protection, they call it industry policy. And they organise their whole economy around the purpose of building the industries which they target. So their education system feeds into their car manufacturing industry, and their subsidies are all geared to a specific outcome. They direct the whole focus of their society on making these industries work, and they succeed at doing that. When I was in Singapore, I was dealing with executives who actually made jokes about Australians, and the subtext of those jokes is that Australians are stupid because we are so easily manipulated. Jokes like an Australian and a Chinese walk into a, whatever. I think the intellectual failing is that we haven't put into the free trade theory the idea of learning. Like, an industry is not stagnant. Nothing in the economy is stagnant. They grow over time, and people learn. There's a expertise and a knowledge base there, and that improves over time. And if you are not in that industry, you are never going to learn. You've locked yourself out of it for all time. So we could have taken the car industry, for instance, and we could have repurposed that to produce electric cars and maybe made them the most efficient electric cars in the world. We can't do that now because we closed that opportunity. So I don't suppose I really have a question. I just want to see if you agree with my idea that it's all about learning and development over time being the important thing, and that's what the economic theories are missing.
Can I make 2 points? Firstly, incomes in Asia and living standards aren't anywhere near Australians. So Australians are much better off compared to most Asian economies. Those economies are growing rapidly, principally because of population. Look at China. There's over 1 billion people there, and they're transforming their economy, and it is a controlled economy. But in many respects, they're liberalising some elements of it as they go as well. And really, when you look at economic development, they're probably a generation behind us in terms of the way economies develop. They're going through a manufacturing phase that Australia and other developed nations went through in the 50s, 60s and 70s. We're moving to a different economic model, if you like, one predominantly based around services in certain cities. And there's going to be a great hunger for those services in Asia as they develop. So there's a big economic opportunity for Australia. If we can transform our economy to deliver those services into Asia, then you're going to see our living standards and our incomes grow even more. It can happen.
I'll be very quick because I can tell Cameron's itching to jump in. But look, I think the economic models are flexible enough to take into account learning, and that is, the economic justification for industry policy is that you support this fledgling new industry, you allow that learning to occur, and eventually you hope it can stand on its own 2 feet. I don't think the car industry is a good example of that. We subsidised that for decades, and it was pretty clear that that was never going to be an economic industry, and nor is it actually anywhere in the world, I don't think.
Thanks, Doug. Funnily enough, we only have a car industry because of the industrial policy we took in the 1930s. There's some great videos getting around on Facebook promoting how we're going to industrialise Australia so we don't get left behind. We're never going to get rich selling wool and dirt to the Europeans. And so the existence of that industry for 50 years was because we, as a society, decided we wanted to become an industrialised country. And definitely that's exactly how it works in Asia. Quite interestingly, in the US at the moment, there's a private space race going on with Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And Jeff Bezos spends $1 billion of his own money every year. He loses it to try and deliver payloads to space on the cheap. Now, none of that would pass any cost-benefit analysis that we would do as economists. And yet ultimately, this billionaire industrial policy is creating cheap satellites, cheap delivery to space, things that have never been done before. So if it's good for them, it's hard to see how it's bad for us as a society as a whole to make those decisions to try and expand the production frontier of the country. We can keep going backwards, and soon we'll catch up to PNG and Mongolia, just as we have been doing. We're a houses and holes economy. We either dig up dirt or we sell each other houses. And I think if you have some perspective about the dollars involved, let's just pick some numbers. We borrowed an extra $100 billion last year to sell each other houses and buy them off each other. 100 billion, 2.5 NBNs, okay? That's 100 years of the space age. No, it's 30 years of the space agency that I would propose. Okay, that's just 1 year of buying and selling houses off each other. So I think once you have some perspective about where we waste our money, then you'll find a lot of things are possible. If we think about calling around to find public housing, I mean, we're going to spend $50 billion on submarines from France and we can't build a few extra houses for people. I mean, that's a joke, right? As a society, we shouldn't stand for that.
Yeah, we don't invest enough in public housing.
Okay, true. We should. So where the money goes is where the vested interests go, where the power goes, okay? So get some perspective about your millions and billions and where it's been wasted, and you'll see we're a rich country and we can manufacture things here again. We can do these things. But we've sort of all convinced ourselves we can't, and that we have to do what the market says. And what the market says is essentially what the mates of the politicians say, and they get their little piece of the pie and leave us all to pay the price. Anyway, now I'm ranting. Next question.
Can I just very quickly jump in and ask? So the conventional wisdom in economics for many years has been that countries go through a transition between being, originally raw goods producers, and then manufacturers, and then service providers. And this is kind of the mental framework that a lot of people, continue to believe, right? And so if you're a developed country, you're kind of moving away from manufacturing, and that's okay. You're going towards services. Do you agree?
No, look at Japan, look at Germany. Even the US still has a lot of manufacturing. Look at Switzerland. A landlocked mountainous country with a relatively huge manufacturing sector. So it's not the case. You just get to the more cutting edge of those things. You don't make big yellow machines that dig dirt. What you do is you make the machine that makes those machines. I don't think it's the default. I think it's been an occasional occurrence in certain countries that have bought into this idea that we're rich, things can be made in Asia, and we'll just tell them what to do with our services.
I'll just make the comment that manufacturing is in decline across all those countries. That's a share of the economy, and I think you're right. You end up with more kind of high-end manufacturing, but that general trend still holds, that it's a shift towards services and away from manufactured goods. So I think that kind of is the way that economies tend to evolve, and there'll obviously be kind of compositional shifts within that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think if you look at the history of economic evolution, they do tend to follow that pattern, but robust economies have mixed industries. And I don't agree with Cameron's assertion that we're miners and household builders or something like that. What you said. I mean, if you look at the biggest generators of income for our economy, it's in health services, education services. So that's where the prosperity lies, and that follows that path of economic evolution that we've talked about.
Next question. Who's got the mic?
I'm from the Department of Employment in Canberra, and we all believe, and I believe that you also agree, that the best way to for someone to get out of poverty and to reduce inequality is by getting the job. So I just wanted to have comments on Daniel's point earlier that you suggested one way to reduce inequality is by raising a new style allowance and rent assistance. So let's say if I was an unemployed person and I have a choice between getting a minimum wage, right, a job with minimum wage, and staying home with higher new style allowance. So what would I choose? Obviously, that is not worth for me to go to take a job. Why? I know that my new style allowance is higher. So what's your point?
I feel like there's a Labor economist in the room that can answer this better than me, but I think there's still a fair gap between New Start and the minimum wage. And the other point I would make is my understanding from real Labor economists is when you look at the people that are getting New Start, it's actually a very small percentage that are long-term unemployed, that are there and sitting on it. What you see instead is it's actually people coming in and out of that payment at particular points in their life where they've lost their job or looking after children or whatever it is. So it doesn't seem that incentive to take New Start and to forego a job is a really strong effect. And I think if you look at the level of the payment, even if it was a little bit higher, slightly more generous, you would understand why. You're not living like a king on New Start by any stretch of the imagination.
Actually, I have a lot of data that can show you what proportion of very, very long-term unemployed people. It's not small at all.
It's not small? I mean, okay. I believe Peter Whiteford has shown some, the data I've seen from him suggests that it is small and most people are coming in and out, but okay, that's...
Cam, Matt, anything?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, who's got the mic?
Hi, I'm Martin O'Connor. I'm also from the Department of Employment. There's a lot of discussion about international trade and industry policy and job losses in manufacturing as a result. But it seems to me there's a major concern about automation also reducing the amount of jobs that are available in manufacturing. So, where it took, 30 people to make a car 100 years ago, now it takes 3. So what do we do with the people who are going to lose their job? Because, if I'm, as Matt said, if I'm 55, I've only ever worked at Ford in Geelong, whether my job has gone to China or to a robot is pretty immaterial. The point is, what do I do tomorrow and what do my kids do? So how do we address that, taking away the argument about, you know, tariffs and trade and industry policy? A lot of those jobs are going to disappear anyway. What do we do with the people and their kids that we're expecting to take those jobs on?
Yeah, automation and technology advance, the digital economy, look, you can't stop it. It's the way of the future. They're services that make people's lives more convenient, and people want them and can more easily access them. So by the same token, they've also generated new employment in new sectors of the economy that we didn't have 20 years ago. So there are benefits from it. The challenge for us is how we provide people with all the necessary skills so that they continue to be employable in the economy. And that's not easy, and I'm not professing to have all the answers to that today, because it comes down to some of the challenges that we have in changes in the economy, structural changes related to automation, changes related to reduction in tariff barriers, changes related to the education system, and you know, how you get people through the jobs network so that they've got access to those jobs. And they're the big challenges that government's facing in a number of areas at the moment.
I think the automation thing is mostly being jumped on by people who need an excuse for poor policy making and don't know why the labour markets are stagnant. Automation's not like a new thing, okay? It's probably slower than it's been in many areas. If you are building the new facilities that automatically produce stuff, by definition, you're employing people to build those things.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. I have been having a look at sort of structural adjustment of late, and I found a paper from an economic journal or something in 1930, worrying about what automotive workers were going to do now that production lines were 15% faster and there were 50% fewer people involved. But you raised the point that Switzerland has a sort of very high value manufacturing industry. Germany does as well. But even in those countries, the share of people employed, even though actual output is maintained or even increased, the share of people actually employed there is declining.
So the more high tech your tools are, the longer it takes to design them, right? And so there's more input into making the next generation of those. So a lot of those service industries will be designing and consulting to work out what the next machine is going to be, what that robot arm does, and how to program it. So they go hand in hand in many ways. But yeah, I mean, there's obviously going to be sudden shocks like the closure of the car manufacturing in Australia, and as you said before, it might take 3 people to build a car now. It takes 0 in Australia by the end of the year. But I don't see that as the main game these days. I just think weak demand and inability of governments to proactively support industries that take a few bets on the future.
Okay, it's just after 5, so unfortunately we have to leave it there, but I would like to thank, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists.